I'm now going to introduce Herman to you, who's going to present the next part of the program. Just something about Herman, what his CV here. Okay, Herman Jonker is a portfolio coordinator of industrial development at the Department of Economic Development and Tourism in the Western Cape. That's the government. He's a broad profile, brief profile. He studied at Stellenbosch, and he had a stint at a university in Amsterdam, whereafter he worked with the Western Cape government, and he started in 2001 with a brief stint, even when it made a turn at Investment Bank in London. So a bit of an international experience there. So through the years, he has been involved with DDAT in industrial development and also environmental sustainability. His subsequent phase from 2011, he has worked on, specialized on economic infrastructure, specifically looking at port-related industrial and logistic developments. This includes working with a team of professionals through the feasibility and application of phases of establishment of the Saldanha Bay Development Zone. His involvement in other proposed mega projects include the reconfiguration of Cape Town's port industrial area and the health, tech and innovation park in that area. His most recent work, he's now moved to Jacobs Bay, so he lives in this area and we have direct communication with him, and we can at any time ask him what is going on in our industrial area. So without further ado, Herman, if you could please come.
Thank you, Andre. I appreciate the introduction and I appreciate the work of the Water Quality Forum Trust. And before I start, I also want to say a quick hello to people that I haven't seen for a long time. I've brushed past a few faces and I've been under a bit of stress here trying to get my presentation ready and the technology to work, so apologies for not having said a proper hello to those familiar faces. I also want to recognize the presence, like Andre did, of the major stakeholders in government, in business, in the NGO and environmental world, and the local community. And it's when you live in a local community that you start to get a little bit of the touch and the feel for it, as opposed to commuting from Cape Town, like I did for a number of years whenever we had project involvement here. It really does make a difference, I think, when one gets a touch and a feel for who's involved in what, and also to try and balance some of the competing demands of the economic system. So like Andre said, I studied a bit of economics. I'm not an economist in the sense that I do economic analysis and forecasts, so please don't ask me about inflation rates or anything like that. I'm more of an economic practitioner. And the last time I spoke here in a couple of years ago, 2019, 2018, I showed you this slide, and I just want to make sure that I start on the right foot and just get the expectations a bit lower. So this is apparently quite a famous psychological analysis of the highest order, and I put performance in the top bubble, where apparently the psychologists put reality in there. So the happiness at the end, on the right hand side, there's your happiness that I'm concerned with. My performance, the one at the top, is a pretty fixed one. It's not going to be much different depending on the circumstances. I've done my presentation and I have an idea of how it's going to be. But if you can just lower your expectation there in the middle, there's much less of a minus in the equation, and you can really add to your own happiness here. And this is not to try and say that government officials are dull and boring, but I am going to dive into a bit of economics, and I know it's not everybody's cup of tea. So let's see how it goes. I'd like to just start by setting the scene quickly and then going into why industrial development happens and why it's important. And then we'll look at some of the future prospects. And I'll fly through it as quickly as possible. We're a couple of minutes behind schedule, and I'll try and make up for it. Sorry for this busy slide. I think this is just a quick look at the past few years, and I'm not going back all the way to 1999 and early 2000s, where the industrial complex in Saldanha started to be established, which is when I started getting involved here with the West Coast Industrial Initiative way back then. And then after that, phases of applications for this concept of an industrial complex or an industrial zone, and then getting national government funding and approval and so on. But I just want to show you quickly a little bit, or remind you of something that I presented here a few years ago, 3 or so years ago, called the West Coast Industrial Plan. And that was just a system by which we tried to put all the industrial development projects into a bit of a catalogue to try and predict when there will be pressure on the likes of bulk utilities, water, electricity, roads and transport infrastructure, as well as some of the community assets like schools, hospitals, community centres, and then get an idea of when to start investing or when to get ready for investment. And we tracked quite a few projects during the phase between 2015 and 2018, and the total amount there was around 5.35 billion rand that was spent on infrastructure in this area in a 4 to 5 year period. So that is very significant. Cape Town brags when they have 2 billion rands worth of investment in a year. We averaged more than 1 billion per year over that 5 year period, and we'll start to track some of the influence of that major infrastructure rollout in the next few years, and there's a bit more to it. Then I also just quickly want to highlight some work done by the municipality called the Strategic Economic and Financial Framework, where not only municipal revenue and what the impact of the growth on the municipality would be was researched, but the system was also built, a model was built to look at what happens if there are economic shocks. And at that stage, we'd just come out of a drought, which was a shock to the system. And some other shocks were thrown into the system. One of it was in-migration on a large scale, beyond expected numbers. In other words, adding to the burden of just the populace. And then things like an environmental disaster, which causes the collapse of the fishing stock. In other words, the main anchor industry here takes a big knock. And then a few other things like closures of factories in the metal sector, national and international recessions. So we weren't predicting anything, but we were certainly trying to look at what would be some of those impacts. And then, of course, last year, year before, some major recessionary pressure was exerted on the economy. And some of my clever colleagues who are actually trained as proper economists did quite a bit of analysis and modeling, even down to municipal level, to look at what the potential effect of the lockdown would be. And they sketched a few scenarios, and they looked at very specific numbers. The ones that are circled there, I'm afraid, I'm not sure you can see it, but it's a percentage dip in the GDP numbers, around 12 to 18% in a medium scenario, and then a climb out of that over a couple of years. And then the table with the detailed numbers were broken down per sector. Of course, tourism took an enormous hit, and it was then predicted it would be around a 43% reduction in the GDP contribution of tourism. We're now also starting to measure whether that was accurate or not, but it seems to be fairly on par. And the bottom line of all this analysis was that we would have a slow recovery. So the dip in the middle there, clearly 2019, 2020, and then the three scenarios: high growth recovery, medium growth recovery, and slow growth recovery, something between 2 and 4 years to just get back to the GDP numbers we had in 2019. And so this is not just a question of we're back to where we were, but that's also still zero growth. So can you imagine someone in 2019 told you there'd be zero growth in the economy for 4 years? So as much as the recovery is looking pretty good, the economic numbers are starting to be quite encouraging. Already the ratings agencies and the international organizations warning that post the first year of recovery, growth slows down very quickly, and it takes a while to get back to those numbers. Then just a quick look at the current reality. Unemployment increased significantly. The data is a bit funny because of how unemployment is recorded, and during the pandemic, people who don't work weren't necessarily looking for jobs, and then they don't come onto the job statistics. But on the left-hand side, sorry, the unemployment numbers clearly higher than ever, so a new record high for unemployment, and also 192,000 jobs shed during COVID. So after COVID, even with a bit of recovery, the total employment lower by 192,000 in the province. And this is youth unemployment, just to zone in a little bit that, yeah, maybe the Western Cape's looking a bit better than the other two major economic drivers, engines in the country, KZN and Gauteng, but consistently and stubbornly high youth unemployment. And I'll get back to the stubbornness and the consistency of some of these numbers. This table, again, apologies for it being so busy, shows 3 rows and besides the name on the left-hand side, 3 columns. And so the basic principle here are 3 areas of the economy were looked at on the low side, the medium side, and the high side. The 3 areas are whether or not educational skills qualifications match what's required in the economy. And the middle one is the size of companies. Are there small companies, medium companies, large companies, and how many of them? And the third one is the value add. So is our economy in the primary sector, secondary or tertiary sector, and what those percentages are. And basically what this shows is quite a strong structural deficiency in our economy, with too much in the small company. The numbers say that we have millions of small companies, a few big companies that contribute mostly to the GDP. Something like 50 companies do 35% of our GDP, and then a real lack in the middle. And I'll get back to that. And similarly with skills, lots of people at the low skill end, a few people at the high skill end, and a big deficit in the middle. You could think artisan skills, think technical personnel. And a similar thing with the sectors, high percentages comparatively in primary and in mining and agriculture, decent percentages on the far side in high value add, but very low in the middle. And this is just showing quickly a bit of the policy scene. Maybe I'll skip this one just to gain a bit of time. The bottom line being that the national government's driving a master plan agenda towards reindustrialization. And here's the question then, why? Why do we industrialize if it puts pressure on the bay, if it puts pressure on our socioeconomic systems, etc.? And the message here is that industrialization is a means to an end and not an end in itself. And what this slide shows on the left-hand side is that economies grow in GDP per capita, i.e. they get wealthier, that's the bottom axis, and on the vertical axis it shows employment in manufacturing. And this talks about the complexity of an economy. If you can manufacture, you're more complex than mining and agriculture. And then at some point you deindustrialize because then you go into high value add services. However, countries that make that curve too quickly don't get up to the high GDP per capita. In other words, don't get wealth into the populace. And sorry, the same message is on the other slide on the right hand side, the graph, but it's a bit more technical, and it just says that if you have a heavy portion of your economy in the primary industry, you remain in low GDP per capita mode. I'll get back to that. Economists have been getting clever. They measure economic complexity, and that is to do with how much productive capacity and knowledge is required for the economy to run. And it shows there that all the rich countries have high complexity, all the poor countries have low complexity, and the graph on the right-hand side is simply showing South Africa losing ground comparatively to other developing nations like Brazil, China, Malaysia. And on the left-hand side now, there's a tracking of South Africa in this complexity index, showing that we've fallen over the last 20 years from around the 40s to 60th place. This is just another level of analysis looking at complexity, and I won't go into this too much, just to say that there's some very sophisticated tools to measure complexity. And here now I'm going to simplify the economics by doing an analogy with a car. So a growing economy is analogous to a car that goes faster, right? So what do we do if you want your car to go faster? Anybody? Drop your petrol. You put your foot on the accelerator. So to get a car to go faster, you need to give it some vuma, right? To get the economy to go faster, you need growth-focused strategies. However, what if this is your car and not that nice yellow Audi in the previous picture? This means that at some point, no matter how hard you put your foot down, you're not going to go faster. And will this help? Cosmetic changes, better tires, not a lot. And the bottom line here is that economies that need to grow will only grow faster up to a point and then start to plateau if there isn't a structural change. If those 3 things that I spoke about in the beginning, size of companies and the split, the type of industry in your mix, and the competency of your factors of production, that includes firms, people, and finance. So there needs to be a structural shift, and the analogy to me is of upgrading to that better car, or at least put a better engine into the City Golf, right? Otherwise you're going to put your foot down hard and you're not going to make it to 120. So South Africa needs some structural shifts that take time, as opposed to just simple growth-focused strategies like let's give more access to finance or let's promote some industries. And that's where we come to industrialization. Industrialization has been the path for all high-income countries to grow out of primary, low complexity, simple productive capacity into more complex and more higher value add activities. And that's essentially why industrialization is driven as a policy in most governments. So just to look at some of the future prospects, firstly, looking back just a little bit, we certainly need to learn from mistakes and not do the same type of industrialization that have been done before. The picture at the top, obviously looking not so friendly, the picture at the bottom looking friendlier, but not of zero impact. And so there needs to be this full consideration of people, planet, and profits, and not just simply a drive to develop industry. And there's a lot of sensitivity currently in government about it, probably not enough. But maybe just a quick look also over the recent past in the Saldanha Bay area. I'm sure everybody's familiar with where that is on the earth. And the green ticks are all the major infrastructure projects over the last 5 years. This does not include the big mega million rand projects like the liquid fuels terminals and the LPG terminal. These are just basic infrastructure, bricks and mortar projects. And I'll get back to this picture in a minute when we look at a few of the other emerging projects. So those are the major ones around the IDZ, Portland, some quayside upgrades, and then some municipal infrastructure upgrades. But in the interest of time, let's move on. Some of the future prospects that I just want to highlight. Firstly, that this is a picture of what it could look like. And as you can see, it looks a lot more like the bottom picture of the two industrialization paths that I showed earlier than the top one. No big smokestacks, no major processing facilities, but rather industrial engineering facilities around the port. And this is much higher value, much more higher complexity economic activity, which drives GDP per capita in any economy. And so just a quick update on some of the IDZ's activity. A bunch of the investor facilities completed. The one on the left-hand side is the real deal, by the way. That's not a Google image. The one on the right-hand side is a future projection. It hasn't been built yet, but that's the idea of what the IDZ should look like in the future. And a third investor is still in the construction phase, 4 new investors in pre-construction, and about 11 other companies in feasibility and concept phase. So there are a few other further components to the investment pipeline, but these are the ones that are the closest by, and the total value of that pipeline already around 20 billion rand. So if you think of the 5.5 billion that grew the infrastructure in the last 5 years or so, there's another 4 cycles of 5 years worth of a billion rand each. So the pressure on the bay and on the natural environment and on some of the infrastructure, bulk infrastructure, will continue to grow. And there's some of the proposed projects, the Strategic Infrastructure Development Symposium that was hosted by the presidency a few months ago. Some of these projects were profiled there, and a lot of the financial institutions, both private and public, have started to commit funding. And there's some quayside development. I think I just pulled out the ones that are closest to the water's edge. There are a few other bigger developments further away from the beach, further away from the harbour, but these are the ones with direct water quality impacts in the very near future. You see some of the jetty and berth allocations there. Then just to close off, and this is not something that's taken hold in our policy documents yet, but I just want to give a glimpse of the policy intent of the Western Cape government. We have a very sharp pro-business focus in our economic approach. And the 5 major areas of focus in our strategic approach coming up would be, number 1, ease of doing business, and there's a bit of detail behind that. But number 2, importantly, exports and investment, and behind that sits a new export strategy focusing on higher value add and higher complexity activities in the economy. And I think Saldanha is already, in terms of economic complexity, quite a bit higher than the rest of the West Coast region. The upside of that is a higher average GDP per capita. The downside of that is that it sounds attractive for job seekers, and there's also a higher in-migration and a higher unemployment rate in Saldanha than in the rest of the district. So, and the challenge there again is that structural one, where if you don't have middle order skills, if you don't have technical capability, you're likely to fall in the lower skill cohort, which is also a position of having very difficult access to economic opportunities. So again, that structural break, higher unemployment but higher GDP per capita. So the great opportunities that are there for our people are not as accessible because of the structural breaks, and skills being one of them. Then just very briefly, the remaining three, enterprise development, I think it's a no-brainer. I won't go into any of the detail. Skills development, exactly to try and break that structural deficit in the system. And then economic resilience is specifically focused on energy provision, and Saldanha being one of the few municipalities that have been earmarked by a province to get ready for purchasing power from independent power producers and being ESCOM and possibly even grid independent. So I just want to conclude quickly by summarizing and saying that we have an economic system that has some difficulties. We can drive the economic system harder to perform better, but there's going to be an immediate ceiling, and it shows in the stubbornness and the consistency of youth unemployment when the structural breaks aren't addressed. And those structural breaks have a much higher chance of being resolved in higher economic complexity activities, and that's why manufacturing, industrialization and industrial development addresses some of the socioeconomic concerns. On the other side, of course, there are pressures on the likes of infrastructure, including natural assets, and I include the bay as an infrastructure element, a natural asset element, and also air quality, our veld and our biodiversity, and that's a big balance that government has to strike. So I have colleagues in another department that keep me honest about our impact on the environment. I'm there to push them in a direction that says we have an economy with people in it that need to prosper, and those structural breaks need resolution. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much, Herman, for a very interesting overview of what's happening as far as economic development and development in general is concerned, industrial development. I know that there are 1,000 questions out there. And obviously in a short presentation like that, not all your needs and requirements as far as that's concerned could be covered. But I'm going to have the following question policy. We're going to go to the next presenter, and then we'll combine these two and take one or two questions before we go for tea. So unfortunately the program is squashed slightly, so please be patient and let's go on with the next presentation.